I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our two participants without further ado. Daniel Dennett is one of the lead thinkers in the so-called New Atheism. He's the author of many works, including important works on freedom of the will, which I've read with great admiration. He's the author of Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and the co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies, and a university professor, the Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University. And Philip Clayton is a philosophical theologian and scholar of religion and science. He's a professor of religion and philosophy right here at Claremont Graduate University and the Ingram Professor at Claremont School of Theology. So we'd like to start then with Professor Philip Clayton.
Thanks. Well, Dan, it's really great that you took the time during your visit to Scripps. I hope everyone will come at 4 p.m. or 4:30?
4:15.
4:15 to your talk over at Scripps. To chat about issues about, what does it say, science, philosophy, and theism or atheism. I'm surveying the web, and I found there are a number of debates that you've taken part in about issues of religion and science. And almost always they have a sense of ships passing in the night. And I think it might be really interesting to have a kind of debate that, as far as I've seen from the web, you haven't had the chance to participate in as much. And that would be a discussion with a sort of a moderate religionist. So I'm clearly a theist. I stand here with that position. But somebody who shares your criticism of many of the more extreme forms of religion. Somebody also who's trained as a philosopher. I think what we're doing is we're picking up here. And so either you might want to click that off or, there we go. And see where that goes. So is that amenable to you? Just open discussion. And so we could go straight to issues of religion, pro and con, and then we'd probably end up in a debate format pretty quickly, and we'd both start throwing out one-liners, and probably there'd be much more heat than light, which the audience might actually enjoy more.
Let's see if we can bore them.
Yeah. But it would be interesting to explore philosophical issues where one would expect us to differ, and maybe it'll turn out that there'll be no common ground, and maybe it'll turn out that we share a surprising amount of common ground, and that's an empirical experiment. I don't know which way it will turn out. So that would be my proposal.
Go ahead.
I'll start throwing out topics, and when you get bored, throw out some of your own, and we'll just see where it goes. All right. So the one that I thought would be interesting to start with is naturalism. And in various books, I've proposed...
Excuse me. Yeah. We got to do something about this sound.
Yeah. Turn them way down, first of all. And then, is your mic actually off?
Yeah, mine's off.
Okay. Yeah, under mic has to be good. We both are loud voiced persons.
Okay.
It's going to drive people crazy.
Everybody can hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a small room, so we don't really need that much.
I'm not bored yet. I just thought.
So I've espoused a position that I speak of as a kind of broad naturalism that takes many different kinds of explanation into account, those of physical sciences, of the biological sciences, of the classic human sciences, and that looks to a particular area of phenomena in the natural world, and it looks to the kind of discipline that can give the most fine-grained explanation of that set of phenomena. I have the sense that clashes, sometimes severely, with a kind of naturalism that you would expect. That seems like an obvious starting point to explore.
All right, I don't see what the clash is. Unlike some other people who are interested in an evolutionary perspective on human beings, I, for a decade and more, have been stressing the importance of cultural evolution as a component. So it's not just genes. In fact, genes are a relatively minor part of the story that I want to tell. It's still an evolutionary story about the human mind, about morality, about art and humor and so forth. It has a genetic basis, but the genes only take you about a third of the way at most. So I'm not sure that we're in disagreement about that. One of the sciences that you think I give short shrift to, or something like that.
Yeah, you clearly, the same comparison to Leo Wilson, you clearly are willing to give a larger role to social explanations than a lot of other people who work in and out of the biological sciences. But you also would have a tendency to speak, for example, when you speak of the three stances, of a hegemony of the physical stance. And you have a lot of cautions about moving to the design stance. There I sense a difference, a greater reticence, it may be epistemic, to moving into explanations in terms of, say, persons and their intentions.
Well, I think that's miscommunication on that part. The hegemony of the physical is just very simple. We obey the laws of physics, and what we do, what a human being does at any moment is, or what an animal does at any moment, is simply what that animal's physical constitution causes it to do at that moment. And the way to think about the three stances is think about something simpler, like a chess-playing computer, one of my threadbare favorite examples. You could try to interpret it from the physical stance and look at the voltage patterns. And 1,000 years from now, you'd still be tracing voltages through before you could understand what was going on. So that's not a very practical sense. But it does rule in the sense that nothing your computer is going to do is going to violate the rules of physics, the laws of physics. If you go to the design stance, now you're considering it as a designed entity, and you're ignoring the voltages, and you're looking, say, at the program level, at one of several program levels. And the difference is that here you're assuming no malfunction. You can't predict the malfunctions at the design level because the design level incorporates. That's why it's a good stance, because it takes the risk of assuming that everything's going to function correctly. You go up one more level, now you're at the intentional stance level, and now you're treating it as an agent. It's playing chess. Now, of course, it may not make the best move, but you predict that it will make the most rational move under its circumstances.
Can I jump in there,
Yeah.
and especially the locution, treating it as, and it has to do with the causal picture that the two of us might tell about what's happening in the natural world. We share a similar, both of us are non-physicists, but presumably we share a similar view of what the physical causal story is.
Yep.
We share very similar or identical view of what the biological story is. We think of, well, I think of both of those as real forms of causality in the natural world. So I'm a realist. In some sense, we may not know the exact causal form, but I'm a realist about those. But when we come to the intentional stance, you seem to pull back from your realism, the causal part of the realism, whereas I don't.
No.
And I'm trying to understand if we have a difference
No.
there.
No, I mean, I give examples. It was her realization that he knew her secret that caused her to blush. Perfectly good causal explanation. It cites an intentional state, her coming to realize this. You can't make sense of this as a phenomenon without looking at the causation at the physical stance, but also, in this case, of course, at the biological. And similarly, when I raise my hand, it's because I decided to raise my hand. That's an intentional stance explanation. It's causal through and through.
Mm-hmm. Now, you could mean caused in the sense that Richard Rorty, in a debate with Rorty, talked about cause. That is, there's a set of appearances, and we have a language that correlates those appearances, and we said cause. But that's why I framed the question out of the standpoint of realism. I would say that there actually are mental causes, and I think that you strongly deny that.
No. I don't know where you got that idea. I am not so much a Rortian as sort of a human about causation, which I think is still got a lot of wisdom in it. And I offer examples of intentional stance causation. In Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I have a lengthy thought experiment about these two black boxes, and what causes the light to go on in one is that a true sentence is being sent down the line to it, and here's a case where you cannot make sense of the causation without going to the intentional stance. That's the whole point of that example. You say that is causation as robust as any in the world. It counts as causation, but you have to characterize it from the intentional stance.
Okay, but now, that's what we do if we're speaking as people interested in interpreting particular data in the world, right? When we step back from useful explanations, as philosophers are wont to do, and ask the question, so what's really happening out there in the world, I think you become a little bit more hesitant but it's from what you've
Oh,
written.
really?
Yeah.
I don't know in what regard. I mean, after all, I've been pushing the idea of the importance of the intentional stance, and contrary to those who said I was some sort of instrumentalist or fictionalist, I said no. This is as real can be. That's what the point of real patterns is. That paper where I say, look, these are real patterns in the world, real patterns, and that's a kind of realism. It's not the same kind of realism as, say, Fodor's realism, which I call hysterical realism. But that's realism. So I don't know what you're. I'm curious about how I failed to communicate this to you, because I manifestly did, and I'm not quite sure why.
Because you'll frequently speak of the hegemony of the physical, and you'll speak of the different levels of explanation, and caution us about the movement toward the other. I mean,
yeah, but that's. I don't think that's even a philosophical point. I think that's just comes out of this sort of quite standard and unproblematic inventory of what's in the world. Let me see if I can think of a case. Whenever you adopt the intentional stance, you're taking on a huge risk, because you're assuming that what you've got in front of you, that you're trying to understand and predict, is an agent that is roughly rational. Now, if that agent has suddenly gone bonkers and is just no longer a rational agent at all, then your intentional story will just fall apart. Doesn't usually happen. But when it does, physical causation still reigns, design stance explanation still reigns, the intentional stance simply drops out. In the same way that it drops out if you have, in the same way that the design stance drops out, you know, I could take my cell phone out and say, you know what it will do if I do this, that, and the other thing. And, well, what happens if I throw it in a bucket of molten lead? Forget the design stance. You want the physical stance to explain that. It's not designed to do anything when it's thrown into a bucket of molten lead.
yeah. Well, let me just say how immensely pleased I am at the first statement of our discussion, because now what I can report to others, I'm just going to check it with you while you're here to make sure that that's correct, is that Dan understands, says there are multiple levels at which we explain events in the natural world, multiple stances. There isn't a sort of ontological priority between them. The only priority is the dependence of the higher levels on properly functioning physical, or it can't be against our own survival, or the next generation won't be around, right? But otherwise, there's no presumption against mental causation, and that was even metaphysical question. I mean, I'm really pleased at this.
Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of confusion about the term mental causation. And I've had a lot to say about what's curious and I think unsupported in, say, Jaegwon Kim's notion of mental causation. I've given my own account of mental causation. I've given my examples. I mentioned the two black boxes example from Darwin's dangerous idea. I said, this is mental causation, right? That's what mental causation is. Kim and some others, they look at this and they say, well, no, because it looks like it's redundant, because we already have physical causation to explain this event, and how can we also have mental causation? And the whole point of that example was to show that, I'm going to just take a minute to give the example. So, these guys down on the beach, and they see these two black boxes, and there's a wire between them. And there's a button, two buttons on box A, and three lights on box B. If you push the alpha button on box A, the red light comes on box B. If you push the beta button, the green light goes on. If you and the yellow light never seems to go on. Okay. But you do this a few billion times, and you establish there's a causal connection between pressing the alpha and the red pressing the beta. So now we have causation, right? Well, now they're going to try to figure out, what's in the boxes that makes this happen. Of course, it could be just a wire, you know, and a battery, but in fact, when they look inside, they find very complicated. In fact, to give away the punchline, there's two artificial intelligence expert systems made by two different teams. And when you press button alpha, the A box generates a true sentence about the world, like Don Larson pitched the only perfect game in World Series history, or Sacramento was the capital of California, or something like that. And if you press the beta button, a false sentence is giraffes are invertebrates, or something like that. Now, what happens in the B box is that the sentences, which are just sent in ASCII code through the wire, inside the B box, it simply evaluates it for truth or falsity. If it agrees that it's true, it flashes a red light. If it thinks it's false, it flashes the green light. And if you send an unformed, ill-formed sentence down, it flashes the yellow light. It says, wow. So that's it. That's the example. Now, what I point out is that until the scientists figure out that this is what's going on, because the programs are completely uncommented. They're just these, each box has a great big computer cranking away. And they've noticed this deep regularity. You push the alpha button, you get the red light. You push the beta button, you push the... But they notice that the signal that's sent down the line is different every time. Never the same line. So they're trying to figure out, what is it about the red strings and the green strings that turns on the red light and the green light? And the answer is truth. If it's a true sentence, the light goes red. If it's a false sentence, the light goes green. You cannot explain the causation here without knowing the intentional level of limitation of the system. Now, notice, our scientists, they've studied these computers. At the physical stance, they are in complete agreement. They know exactly what happens at every microstep along the way. They know exactly what happens in the programs. Still, they're baffled. They can explain each particular case of causation from the physical stance or the design stance. What they can't explain is the causal generalization. Namely, when you push the alpha button, the red light goes on. They know it's true, and they cannot explain it without having the intentional level. And that is my simple toy model of why you need the intentional stance causation, because what you need to explain is, yeah, but why did she blush? Well, because she suddenly realized that he knew her secret. That's why she blushed. And you need to have the intentional level. If you don't know English, and you hear the sentence that went in her ear, and then you see her blush, and you try to figure out from the physical properties of that acoustic signal going in her ear, you'll never figure it out.
Okay, but Dan, now I'm disappointed. You've taken away with your right hand what I thought you were giving with your left, or vice versa. Because the rhetorical force of the example has to do with the story of the wires. And then we have a description we can give of the behavioral outcomes, but we don't really, if this is an analog to the human person, we don't really agree, you and I, about what's happening in that case. So we may not be able to convince each other, but I just want to make sure for the sake of the audience that we can be clear where we've parted ways, right? And so it reminds me of Alan Pascal at UC San Francisco. We were talking once about mental states, and he pounded the table and said, wires and chemicals, that's all it is, wires and chemicals. And you might say, well, Alan, that's fine, wires and chemicals and the intentional stance.
Wires and chemicals and the design properties of those wires and chemicals. Yes.
Exactly. Now we say something different then.
Well, then what are you saying? What else is there?
Because when at the beginning it seemed that we were agreeing about various levels of the structuring of natural phenomena, causality and explanations correlating with each level, I was taking that all the way up. Whereas what actually happened is you silently exited at some point, which I presume happened soon after the neurology, the structure of the brain states.
Well, I don't know what you're straining at here, Philip. I'm saying you have all those wires and chemicals, but unless they are in a particular functional organization, you're not going to have an intentional stance interpretation. But if you do have that organization, that suffices. You don't need some extra, you don't need any élan vital, you don't need any mind stuff or ectoplasm. The mental level is simply constituted by the successful functioning of those wires and chemicals, to use the phrase that you've introduced, in that order. That's what it is to have a mind.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of a position that Michael R. Beebe took years ago. He called them conceptual schemes, and he said they move all the way up and down. They're basically waves of speaking, maybe like a Wittgensteinian language game. But my commitment, I suppose, ontologically, is to say that where an explanation is the best way to explain some set of natural phenomena, I take that as expressing causes in the world and as expressing states of affairs. So we have a different, as it were, an ontological interpretation. Now, of course, all claims are fallible, but I'm not convinced that when I move beyond wires and chemicals, I have to say, now I'm speaking as if.
No, I don't say as if. I say that's what it is to be embarrassed. And it's the embarrassment that causes the blush, and it's the belief that causes the embarrassment. And what it is to have the belief is to have the wires and chemicals taking on a particular configuration at a particular time in virtue of what went in the ear.
Yeah. Remember Quine's description that he loves desert landscapes, right? And there's somewhat more of the desert in your description, right? That is where I'm willing to continue the ontological commitment as the causal, as the explanatory language goes. You switch toward the desert, head toward Palm Springs down the road here.
So speaking of which, since I'm from Riverside, could you, Philip, say a little bit more about the relationship between your line of questioning and bigger issues about religion?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about the intentional stance all day, but I think other people came with other agendas.
Okay. What happens is that what we say about some of the topics that have been the big questions in, say, the history of Western philosophy will be markedly different depending on which answer we take to this particular question. So there will be a parting of the ways. And we could name, and if we wish, explore a variety of issues where we will give different answers given our difference on this first issue,
Okay.
right? Or we can jump directly to the one that the audience wants us to talk about, the God question, where we're likely to have the least amount of common ground. But we'll have different things to say about consciousness, about qualia, about freedom, about what we take, what kind of language we're realist about, and what kind of language we're not.
Okay.
Right.
Fire away. What issues do you want to talk about?
Yeah. So, for example, my explanations, when I look for kinds of explanations of behavior of some set of persons, I'll be utilizing language similar to our everyday or folk psychology, and I'll be taking that as a justified best description of phenomena in the natural world.
Sounds, yeah, I think typically I would agree with that, sure.
No, you very famously have not agreed with that when it comes to
really?
conscience. So, for example, yeah, because utilization of folk psychological language is something that we are able to interpret in terms of these deeper or more fundamental stances.
The fact that I have an account of how folk psychology is grounded in the natural world doesn't mean that I don't take folk psychology seriously. On the
I
contrary.
didn't say you didn't take it seriously.
Well, indeed. After all, I'm the one who introduced the term folk psychology into the discussion and championed it. Said, that's what we do. That's what adopting the intentional stance is. And I have tried to offer an account of how it works and why it works. So there, I'm saying, this is a natural phenomenon. It's a real phenomenon. These are real patterns. And I've got an account, right or wrong, about how come it exists in our world. I don't know how much more realist you want me to be.
No, that's strange if you say that, because it's clear that we disagree on this topic. So when we're explaining some set of phenomena in the natural world, you will talk about persons, for example. That's part of what it means to affirm the intentional stance. But when I speak of subjects and subjective states in qualia, you have very carefully said, well, here's the point where we should resist our ontological.
Well, now you've changed the subject. Now you want to talk about qualia. And
Explain.
yes. Close your eyes and rub your eyes, and you get some colors. Ooh, that's nice. A little sort of almost lime green there. Okay. I just wanted to give you an example of a quality. It's a subjective. It's a quality of a subjective experience. So the smell of pizza, the taste of watermelon, those subjective colors you can get without even looking out into the world, itches and tingles and weird feelings and so forth, those are qualia. I mean, philosophers call those qualia. Now, I've been a critic of the term qualia for a very simple reason. It's a philosophical term of art, it's not in everyday language. And a lot of people outside of philosophy, particularly in cognitive science, have thought that philosophers who talk so glibly about qualia have succeeded in defining it clearly and carefully so that they can use it. So being interdisciplinary, they help themselves to this wonderful term, qualia. The trouble is that philosophers have never agreed about what qualia are. It is an embarrassment, it is a scandal. There is no agreement about what qualia are among philosophers. And so when philosophers very knowingly talk about, well, we're talking about qualia, anybody should say, wait a minute, which of the 7 different theories of qualia are you referring to? Because it is not a well-established term. And if we had the PowerPoint set up, I'd give you my example. I'll simply describe it, and then you'll see why it's a bad term. So you've got the idea. These are sort of subjective. They are features of your conscious state. Okay. Now, how many of you know what change blindness is? A few people do. Let me quickly tell you. If I had the screen up here and I was showing you a change blindness stimulus, what you would see is a picture, like a picture of a kitchen. Then the screen would go black for just about 150 milliseconds. Then you'd see another picture, same kitchen, and it would be picture, 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 picture. However, it's actually 2 pictures. It's the A picture and the B pictures. A flash, B flash, A flash, B flash, or A blank, B blank, A blank, B blank. And there's a big change between the A picture and the B picture. That's change blindness. Because you can look at it and you will not see the change. Oh, eventually you'll see it. And when you see it, you'll laugh because it's that big. And you'll be amazed that you could fail to see such a big change. For instance, the color of one of the panels in the kitchen changes from light yellow to dark brown. And once you see it, it's like a beacon flashing at you. But you could see that for, say, 10 times and not see it. So now I could have given you the experience if we'd set this up, but we didn't. But I told you what the experience is. So I give it to a room about this many people, philosophers. They've all had this subjective experience. And then I say, all right, you all had the experience. Now, I want to know, before you noticed the change, before you could point to it, were your color qualia changing? About a third of the audience says, yes. About a third of the audience says, no. And the other third says, oh my God, never thought of that. That's a well-defined term. I've just given you this vivid example of subjective experience, and they don't even know how the term should be used, and they didn't even realize, so I pointed it out, that they weren't in agreement about how it was used. The term is just bankrupt, so we shouldn't use it.
Let me ask something here. Philip has been wondering whether Dan is an instrumentalist about mental states, and Dan has been saying, in general, he's a realist about mental states, but he's very skeptical about qualia or subjective. But what I'd like to know from Philip is, what does it matter for the bigger questions, like this debate between realism and non-realism about mental states? Why is that important to one's views about God, let's say?
Yeah.
You've treated the difference that we identified as a merely technical difference within philosophy. But I think it actually is something that impacts greatly on the people in this room on each of our understanding of what kind of an agent we are, or what it is for me to be a person. What it is for me to be a person is to have a large set of subjective or internal states, for those to be very crucial to who I am. I know that they are the results of certain processing in the brain. If I, at this moment, have a stroke, or if I imbibe the liquor before this meeting, the verbal behaviors would be different, the internal behaviors, experiences would be different, but the experiences are very much a real part of what I am to be an agent in the world.
I don't deny any of that at all. I agree. I agree. I've written whole books on the subject. What I said is that people, philosophers, have taken what you just said, and then they have taken aspects of it and cranked it up, inflated it, and given it metaphysical significance that it doesn't have. They've turned qualia into these absolutist, they've given definitions of qualia, which are just bonkers.
But that's the point where we disagree.
Okay.
Because what you see as a metaphysical cranking up of what you and all rational people obviously assert is what I see and many of us see as a correct description of what it is to be an agent in the world. What it is to be an agent in the world is to have intentions, to be a center of awareness, to act out of those really existing experiences in the world. So I tell a mental story as well as the physical story, and I give reality to both of those. And I'd be interested. I don't know how you respond to this one. Donald Davidson is famous for speaking of anomalous monism. So he says that there is a really existing kind of mental life, and it isn't one that can be reconstructed in terms of any kind of natural law. Now, I've never seen you affirm that. It would seem inconsistent with things that you've actually said to affirm it, whereas that's a position that I would actually maintain. And then from that, I think...
All right, we shouldn't spend much more time, because this is a technical point. Don Davidson's anomalous monism, what means anomalous is just that there aren't any laws on normals. Right. There aren't any laws tying particular types of conscious states to particular types of, say, chemical states. I agree with that. But there's also, I'm also an anomalous monist about, let's say, a PowerPoint. There aren't any physical laws that connect PowerPoint slides to the computer they're on. PowerPoint slides are as various as you could imagine, and the idea that there would be laws relating particular slides to what's going on in the computer is just crazy. That's anomalous monism.
Yeah, now that's a highly significant difference, because what you've taken is an example of some correlation, some Humean, a correlation between two vastly different kinds of things, and say, well, there's a regular correlation, that's not law-like. Whereas I'm speaking of something which is explanatory without being based on natural law. So my certain desires or ideas, say philosophical notions that I have, are having effects, but not ones that can be reduced to or reconceived in terms of some lower level of laws. Well, I think that really, it may be hard to make it sharp in a short debate, but I think that's a pretty significant difference between
then also between you and Davidson, because I think this view is the view that I've just expressed. You may mean something else by anomalous monism than he means. So, but at any rate, I think that's a technical issue for philosophy of mind that doesn't really hinge on.
Okay.
I don't.
Let me make a comment about the kind of discussion we've been having, and then make the transition to religion in our last half of our discussion, a little less than half. The issues that we've been discussing, we've discussed in good conscience, with arguments we touched the surface of, but with terms we know where we could go in more detail. So I think we're fairly clear on the kind of discussion. It's done, I think, with some real philosophical differences, but in a way that we can carry out a reasonable discussion. And we don't have to agree that it was reasonable and perhaps even fruitful to discuss some of these issues. I view human religious positions and other metaphysical positions as in the same category. So I think that it's possible for us to, as for me as a theist, for example, for you as a non-theist, to have a discussion over some of these issues, which will be highly analogous to the kind of discussion we had or tried to have in the first half of this discussion.
Let's find
But
out.
somebody reading your books would not think that that would be something that you would endorse. So that whether, you know, the constant reference to religion is something which is by and large negative in its effects. And there may be a few benign religious people, as you call them, here or there. But to be bright is more or less to be anti-religious. And that's a position where I think we definitely are.
To be bright is, to be gay is not to be anti-hetero. It's just to be different. To be bright isn't to be anti-religious, it's just not to be religious. I don't think that gays hate heteros or want heterosexuality to disappear, and I don't think brights want religion to disappear. Some of them do, I'm sure. But a lot of us don't. I'm not anti-religion. I'm critical of religion. I think we should all be critical of religion. I'm very critical also of the AMA and of giant pharmaceutical companies. I'm not anti-giant pharmaceutical companies. I'm very glad that they exist. However, I do not think they are above criticism. I think they should be treated with no more respect than they do, and that everything they do is subject to critical examination. And I think exactly the same thing is true of religion. It is a one phenomenon, one set of institutions among many, and I will treat religions, all of them, with as much respect as they deserve, and no more.
It's interesting that in your description of religious phenomena, you give us typically you will take us the defining examples, the ones drawn from fundamentalists, the ones that are anti-intellectual, and so that, and then those will be that will be the standard on which the religion. I think what we need to do to engage in the kind of civil debate, or to encourage the kind of interaction within society where religion can have its benign influence, is to avoid lumping all human religious phenomena together under these sorts of comments, and to begin to single out and to endorse and to engage in dialogue with those sorts of positions that can function within our society.
Well, I think that the people, religious people, have the following problem. It's a real quandary. They know that in every religious tradition there is some unpresentable radicalism, fanaticism, and it's everybody's problem. And moreover, it should be the particular problem of the people in the same religion. Christian fanatics should be the particular problem of Christians, and Islamic fanatics should be the particular problem of Muslims, and so forth. And the irony is, and this is, I don't think there's any cure for this, every person who goes out and does really wonderful good works for whatever their religion is providing protective coloration for the bad people in the same faith, and is elevating. You know, the mafia would be so clever if they went out and built a lot of hospitals and things like that, you know, because then they wouldn't be so obviously bad guys. And the fact is that every time a benign religious group does good works, and they do a lot of them, they cannot help but give succor and cover to the malignant versions of the same religion. And I don't know, if you've got a solution to that problem, I'd love to hear it.
How's that different from science? Because isn't there a lot of bad that gets done in the name of science?
Yeah, there is, but good, fortunately, the scientific community is forthright in its criticism and its rooting out of that. I do not see the liberal Christians going out and naming names and calling out the radical fundamentalist Christians and saying, you know, you are a disgrace to Christianity, which is what the scientists say to the bad scientists.
Yes, but there I simply have to say that empirically that's false.
Oh, really?
That there is, I mean, we're in a community here, for example, many groups of progressive religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who are absolutely opposed to those sorts of behaviors, who not only refuse to cover for it, or not trying to cover for it, but actually make the center of their interpretation of what religion is, religious belief and practice is, to challenge those behaviors. Fanaticism, fundamentalism, violence, of course, but even cases where religion becomes a cover for irrationalism. So we make as the center of our understanding of religious belief that we will follow reason where it goes. Now, I actually think that reasoning about our experience as a whole toward religious conclusions rather than undercutting them. So rather than having to say, well, there's some point where I'm just going to pull a trump card and give you some absolute truth, I'm willing to take the reason arguments all the way as long as we can continue to reason. But I would never get the impression from reading your work that this group even existed.
Come on, Philip. That's you're confusing me with Christopher Hitchens. I did very well on Christopher and his book, but my book is the one which notoriously is full of gentle praise and so forth for religious traditions. I think you talk about lumping. You're lumping me in with. It's really interesting, and you're not the only one. You know, I was one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I couldn't count on, it would take more than my hands and my toes to count all the reviews of the four of us that say how strident and angry and vicious we are, and then they quote the one bad line from Doc, or the one angry line, the one that you quoted in Oxford from Richard's book, and some juicy lines from Christopher Hitchens, maybe a line or two for Hitchens. They never quote anything from me. Why? Because they can't find anything. I mean, they would if they could. Have you got a quote? Have you got something horrible that I said about religion and breaking the spell? Tell me.
But I find breaking the spell very similar to the comment you made just a few minutes ago, that even benign Christians, even the word benign is interesting. It means they're not cancerous in the way it will kill the body.
They're not malignant.
Yeah, they're not malignant. So that's the closest to a positive statement one can find.
Oh no,
but
that is simply not true.
The benign religious people are, all they'll do is try to give a more or less non-harmful view of their beliefs and practices, but not speak up against the misuses of anti-reasonable and anti-scientific religion. I mean, I think it's great that on Evolution Sunday, it's this Sunday, isn't it? And there are some 400 churches where people are actually preaching on Darwin. I mean, and consulting with scientists who are helping to make sure they get the science right. So actually taking leadership as religious people to embrace the results of science, to engage with science, to think about our existence in terms of those results. I think that would actually characterize the form of religion that I and many of my co-religionists would be involved
Well,
in.
that's great.
But one wouldn't quite sense that from the tone of breaking.
How about, what are, from your perspective, Dan, what are 2 or 3 of the major positive contributions of religion?
As I say in the book, there are many people who find love and support in religion, and they can find it nowhere else. For people who are alone and lonely and desperate, churches take them in and provide them a meaning for their lives. That is wonderful. Churches are great for moral teamwork, and I talk about that in the book too. They have accomplished a lot. In fact, I say that it is, in a way, a sad reflection on secular institutions that people in large parts of this country, the good news is they want to lead good lives. They want to do good. They want to do good. And they look around, and the only way they can see to do a lot of good is by joining a church. So they join a church because that is the only institution in their neighborhood where they think they can do good works. And they're right. That's all good. and I say so. Huh?
Yeah, thank you. When religion becomes really interesting, and when the explanation of religious persons and religious phenomena, I think, begins to match reality, is when the idea of a moral community which supports altruism is linked with a lifestyle of the pursuit of reflection and being reasonable. So it's linked with, let's say broadly, the philosophical quest. And when that is linked with an account of reality, religious accounts of reality, and that's the point where it would be fascinating if, as two philosophers who know the Western tradition, if we could find the ability to engage in that kind of dialogue. So, for example, there are views that this reality that we see around us has beneath it some deeper level of reality. There are views that there's some transcendent source with which natural world as a whole is involved. There are views that we participate in that source. Now, I think that those, let's just take those as examples, or that the ground of reality is not less than personal, right? Now, those are positions which it seems to me one could engage in debate. We won't be able to resolve them in the same way that we can resolve phenomena of the Pauli exclusion principle or something, but they remain a part of what it is to be a human being. And the kind of account of reality that people in these moral communities, these churches or synagogues, tell about themselves. And it's that bringing together those three dimensions which I think gives the overall picture of what the religious stance is. So a philosophical quest, an attempt to live in certain ways, and a metaphysical account.
From your perspective, Philip, what are a couple, two or three of the most worrisome or negative impacts that you see religion making?
When one acknowledges that there are discussable questions that go beyond what natural scientific accounts can give, that try to offer a broader framework within which we can understand the world that we live. When one then engages with those questions right at the limit of knowledge, there's a certain danger to say, and I know exactly what is the nature of that ultimate mystery. To say that I have a final truth in a particular scripture, and then to act in authoritarian way, not only with regard to truth claims, but with regard to morality, community, and the rest. The kind of progressive religion, moderate religion that I defend, would eschew that move. So in our debate, everything would be open to discussion. But nonetheless, the worldview that I hold as a theist doesn't match the worldview that you hold as a non-theist. We'd grapple to bring them into connection. We'd sometimes be able to engage and sometimes fail. But I wouldn't make the move and wouldn't endorse the move of quoting a scripture verse to resolve the truth question.
What I don't understand, Philip, is how you know that your view differs from mine, since, as near as I can tell, one of the features of your position is that your position is mysterious, that you can't know. Maybe actually you believe just what I believe. It's just that how can you tell? I mean, you're in a bind because on the one hand you want to say there's this transcendent thing, and then you can say, but we can't know anything about it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
well then,
that's a great topic.
What?
That's a great topic. Because that's
what makes you so sure there is
Yeah.
that if you can't know anything about it?
Yeah, because that's not the position that I advance,
Oh, okay.
nor the position that I hold.
Okay.
If one said, well, look, we know that science is mystery, and I happen to know that mystery has the following features, that Western's
would be
confession, right? But in fact, I think that the nature of human reflection is to go from things that we have deep agreement on. So think of it in terms of Persian communities of experts. And then there are matters which are harder to nail down, especially with regard to explanations of human behavior, right? And then there are questions about the nature of reality, which the philosophical tradition has raised throughout its histories, the 2.5 millennia in the West, longer in the East, perhaps. And it seems to me that we have a sort of epistemic continuum of discussable questions that go from ones that you and I just would take as established fact, or very strongly supported theory, to questions that people disagree, interpretation of quantum mechanics, to questions about the nature of human beings, where there seems to be an almost irreducible pluralism, Likewise with broader metaphysical hypotheses, such as the four suggested before. And that continuum moves toward a point where maybe language breaks down, but argument can go so much further than you've acknowledged or it's come out in this.
Well, in one sense, I think you're right. Argument can go so much further. The question is whether it can go so much further. A great deal of so-called philosophical argument seems to be just, as I notoriously put it once, intellectual tennis without a net. And if a topic is so imponderable and so hard to define as that, the question of why spend time and energy pursuing it is a pretty good question.
It's a great question. Let me offer 3 answers. It seems to me that the empirical questions, scientific questions, naturally give rise to philosophical issues of this sort. And actually, interestingly, grappling with the philosophical issues often serves heuristically to help guide us in making progress on some of the empirical issues. Philosophy of biology has worked that way. Questions about the nature of human beings can offer guidance to the social sciences. Next, it seems to me that there is a natural progression in the questions, so there's no reason to stop just at some point. It seems to me that we won't know whether we can make progress until we engage in those questions. And finally, the biggest danger, it seems to me, is to say that we have all that humans know, we know with certainty, and the areas which are speculative, which are difficult to figure out, the hardest philosophical issues leave us with no idea how to proceed. I guess I would argue it belongs somehow to the nature of what it is to be a human person, to grapple with those questions that stretch our reason into areas where we go as far as we possibly can go.
Well, I agree completely with that. In fact, my sort of thumbnail definition of philosophy is philosophy is what you're doing until you know what the right questions are. And in every area of human curiosity, if you haven't yet figured out whether this is the right way to couch it as a question, then you're doing philosophy. It is ineluctably informal. There's no official rules. You try to be as reasonable as you can. And whenever we make progress, we get a new question. Now, that question, we know how to answer that. That's not philosophy anymore. That's physics or chemistry or biology or psychology. And then what's left for philosophy is just what you said. It's grappling with the residual curiosities and concerns where we don't yet have an agreed upon procedure about how to address them.
Yeah,
that's what philosophy is. But I don't think it has anything to do with theology.
Yeah. So I think that's beautifully described. And the only thing that what I find disappointing is what I understand of a religious existence is something very much like that description. So I think that grappling with questions of ultimacy, attempting to follow my best understanding of where they lead, and to live in a way that's appropriate, would be at the center of what it is for me to be a religious person. Not dogmatism, artificial certainty, and claiming to know what I also claim I can't possibly know. That's not interesting.
No,
And when I find religious persons whose lives and whose thought is interesting, they are of this sort.
No, but then when I find secular people whose lives are interesting, exactly the same is true. They're not dogmatic. They recognize that they don't have all the answers. And perhaps an issue we should look at is whether or not a belief in God plays any role at all in the idea of morality. Because I've argued no, and of course this goes back to the Euthyphro. If we're good because the gods command it, then it's just arbitrary, and if the gods command it because it's good, then we don't need the gods' command. It's good because it's good. Now, I think that the basis for our morality comes from an idealized community of mutual persuaders. We bring everybody in, say, y'all come, whatever you think the good life is, whatever you think is right, we're gonna hash this out. And there's rules for how to be reasonable and tolerant, but nobody gets to say, well, my religion says this and that's it. If you say that, then you've just declared yourself disqualified for this. Okay.
So we share this
We're on-
notion, sort of ideal speech situation. How about that?
Nobody gets to play the faith card.
Yeah.
Okay, but now, this is an entirely secular process. And whatever it arrives at, and this might be a consensus that changed over the years, there could not be a better ground for morality than that. Because it's us. We have decided. We've done everything in our power to mutually persuade each other of the right way to live. And this is what we've done so far. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe some eloquent person has spooked us into a distortion of some sort. But allowing for that possibility, and hence with a certain amount of humility and non-dogmatism, we say, this, so far as we can see, this is the way to live.
Yeah.
And all the sacred texts in the world can be brought into that discussion as raw material, and not a bit of it comes in as authoritative.
Yeah, it's really
Now,
interesting.
what is?
Yeah, no, it's great.
It's a secular position.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe it as, quote, an entirely secular process, because I understand that as the internal logic of my own life as a religious person.
I think you're an entirely secular position.
And I think there's a deeply religious side to it.
I mean, actually,
Well, that's what you said at the end of the Oxford discussion. You said, I'm just an
At Cambridge,
atheist in Cambridge, yeah, and you said I'm an atheist who won't admit it. But
the view you described, Cambridge, was so reasonable. It was so reasonable.
that it had to be.
It was so natural. I mean, there was nothing supernatural.
Ooh.
I think he said that. And I thought, right, it's like gravity. I believe in gravity. Maybe I'd have the same religion that you do.
No, it was a position metaphysically distinct from your own position. I mean, that's good.
Okay.
And it's that this notion of self-emptying is not some recent, philosophical creation, but something that comes right out of the core of the tradition, the Christian tradition that I was describing.
I'd be interested in hearing Philip say, if someone were to say, and Dan just said this, that you are a thoroughly secular person, what would be left out for you, or what would be missing?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Because as part of my understanding of religion is involving the goal of altruistic life and community, of philosophical quest, which we apparently are in agreement on, and then this worldview side. And I think that's the part that we can't leave out. So it isn't necessary to have a religious stance in order to be moral. That's the point that we agree on. But I think that our morality links together with the sum total of what we believe and affirm. So it links together with what we take to be the case. For example, where is there need and where is there not need? And that broader worldview includes beliefs about the empirical world, beliefs about oughts, but it also includes beliefs about what is ultimately the case, or ultimate reality. And on that, when it comes to that point, we have a disagreement. Now, it might take us several hours to get clear on what propositions you would affirm and I would deny, or vice versa. But to leave out the belief component and to treat religion only in terms of its behavioral manifestations would be to do injustice to what it is to be a religious person, at least for most of us.
In a nutshell, what's wrong with what he just said?
I don't know what he means or doesn't mean by belief in an ultimate reality. I think I have a belief in an ultimate reality. It's the universe, it's the laws of nature, it's our existence here. And that's about as ultimate as I can get. I don't think, not only do I have no belief in anything beyond that, I have no sense that I'm missing something or that there's even any room for a belief in anything beyond that. I see why people in the past thought there was. And when I confront the existence of theology, why does it exist? And my shoot from the hip diagnosis is this. Over the eons, over the millennia, every generation, there's a lot of people who just think whatever the local religion is, that's fine with them. They don't think about it too much and they go along with it. And every generation has to people that it's not good enough, and they're skeptics, and they're smart, and they're reflective, and they think about it, and they think about it, and they think about it, and some of them just say, well, all right, I don't believe any of this, and they go their way, and there may be philosophers. And then there's the ones who, maybe out of a sense of loyalty or a sense that they must be missing something, they try to take the views of their generation and mold them into something that they can assert with a straight face. Those are the theologians. They are sort of, they're the spin doctors of religion.
It's unfortunate to take the word theologian and to give it only that negative spin, speaking of spin doctors. It would seem to me much more interesting to use theology for progressive or benign religious persons to speak about the difference that came out at the very beginning of your answer to John's question. And that is, you view what is ultimate in a particular way, and I view it in a different way. We have a disagreement about ultimacy. Right? You would say, not only do I think that this universe that we see is the only ultimate, I cannot understand what the other would mean. Or any claim beyond that becomes meaningless if you want to take a positivist answer. And I would say I believe this universe is a product of, or is contained within, an ultimacy, an ultimate reality, which is broader and deeper. That's a difference in worldview. That gives rise to a kind of discourse which we could call on your side atheist, and on my side theist or theological. Why should we have to stop the kind of civil philosophical discourse we've engaged in to this point in order to carry out that disagreement? Why would I have to suddenly start flinging scripture versus your direction to be theological? That's what's really important.
Well, let me ask you, if you changed your mind about that, about what's ultimate, what difference would it make? What would the world look like to you then?
Yeah. Worldviews are basic to how we construe our existence in the world, how we view it and interpret it, and then they tell a part of a single story that involves our moral decisions, understandings of human persons, and so forth. So I want to say that a religious view is in some ways like a blick, the term that Hare used years ago. But the difference is, it's a blick where you and I can disagree, recognize our disagreements. I can follow out the entailments of your position, recognize where you're coherent or sometimes incoherent. You can follow out the entailments of my position and accuse me of being incoherent at certain points. So an overall view, including beliefs about ultimate reality, morality, and factual beliefs.
Well, see, I still don't see, in effect, from your perspective, what I'm missing. I want to know, could anything ever happen in your experience that would make you go, oh my gosh, I was wrong about ultimate reality? What would it be to discover, or maybe you would be wrong to think you discovered, what would it be to sort of wake up and think, oops, wow, I was wrong? Yeah. And if you can't tell me, then I don't know what you think you're right about.
Yeah. People regularly shift their position on questions of religious belief. So somebody might say the following death that occurred, one of our colleagues died, one of our students died today, and I might just say, boy, a world that includes that sort of terrible death just is not acceptable. And I cannot believe that that is a world created by a not less than personal God with benevolent intentions toward us. Likewise, people sometimes go from an atheist position to a theist position. What's really interesting is that this involves not only certain functional behaviors in the world, it also involves different beliefs about what ultimately exists. So if you came to believe tomorrow that there really is a subject that has qualia, you would hold a different belief about the world than you currently hold. If I came to believe that there isn't a God or a deeper level of reality, I would hold a different set of beliefs. That's a real difference.
Actually, I've let things go on because it's so interesting. But I probably should do my duty as moderator and end things. Before I end things, let me remind you that Professor Daniel Dennett will be giving a talk on Darwin's dangerous idea and related topics at Balch Hall, Scripps College at 4:15. I'd also like to thank Claremont Graduate Union and Claremont for hosting this event, and Professor Dennett and Professor Clayton.